12:15 in the afternoon. The Port of Aden, Yemen. The destroyer DDG-67 USS Cole was finishing its final mooring maneuvers for a brief refueling stop when the first unauthorized contact appeared on the shimmering horizon. Within 90 seconds, the bridge team realized that the three small craft approaching their port side were not the expected harbor security, but a coordinated strike force moving with lethal intent. The air in the harbor was thick with the scent of heavy diesel exhaust and the oppressive, stagnant heat of the Gulf of Aden. Below the waterline, the hull of the 8,500-ton warship sat motionless against the refueling buoy, a massive and stationary target in the glassy, still water. The refueling operation was a standard procedure for the United States Navy vessel as it made its way toward the Persian Gulf. The crew had been at a modified security posture, with watchstanders posted at the M2HB 50 caliber machine guns located on the forward and aft sections of the ship. However, the restrictive rules of engagement in a neutral port created a moment of hesitation that the attackers were prepared to exploit. The three boats were fiberglass-hulled, fast attack craft, each approximately 30 feet in length and sitting dangerously low in the water under the weight of their concealed payloads. At exactly 12:16, the lead boat corrected its course, turning sharply toward the center of the destroyer. The two trailing vessels mirrored the movement, forming a tight wedge formation that increased their speed to 40 knots in less than 10 seconds. On the bridge of the USS Cole, the officer of the deck raised his binoculars, tracking the white wakes cutting through the turquoise water of the harbor. There were no radio responses from the approaching craft, and no signs of slowing down as they crossed the 1,000-yard mark. The commanding officer was notified immediately as the bridge team began shouting warnings over the loudhailer system. On the deck, the gun crews tracked the targets with their 50 caliber barrels, but the presence of civilian harbor craft in the immediate vicinity made a clear line of fire difficult to establish without risking collateral damage. The attackers knew the geography of the port perfectly, weaving through the anchored barges to mask their final approach until they were within 500 yards of the destroyer's midsection. The tactical situation was deteriorating at a rate that bypassed standard command protocols. To be carrying 500 pounds of high-grade plastic explosives, enough to breach the double-reinforced steel of an Arleigh Burke-class hull. The bridge crew watched through the reinforced glass as the three boats maintained a perfect intercept course, their engines screaming at maximum revolutions per minute. The spray from their bows kicked up a fine mist that caught the midday sun, creating a deceptive beauty seconds before the moment of collision. At 300 yards, the intent of the Iranian-made craft was undeniable. The lead pilot stood up in the cockpit, one hand on the tiller and the other braced against the console, steering directly for the engine room compartments of the USS Cole. The watchstanders on the deck began to shout for the order to open fire, their fingers hovering over the triggers of the machine guns. They could see the faces of the men in the boats now, a sight that confirmed this was not a navigational error or a mechanical failure. The distance closed to 200 yards in a heartbeat. The sound of the high-performance outboard engines echoed off the concrete piers of the harbor, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the ambient noise of the port. The United States Navy sailors on the weather decks scrambled for cover or braced themselves against the railings, realizing that the stationary position of the ship made an evasive maneuver impossible. The destroyer was tied to the buoy, its engines cold and its massive weight working against it. The final 100 yards were a blur of white water and gray steel. The lead boat angled slightly to hit the ship just below the galley, where many of the crew were gathered for the midday meal. The second and third boats followed in a staggered line, aiming for the forward and aft engineering spaces to ensure maximum structural failure. The sun beat down on the deck of the USS Cole, illuminating the final seconds of the peace that had existed only moments before. The bridge crew gripped their consoles, the silence of the command center broken only by the frantic updates of the radar operators. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was a physical certainty that would redefine the mission of the vessel in a single, violent instant. 12:17 in the afternoon. The port side of the destroyer, DDG 67, USS Cole. The lead fast attack craft struck the hull at the waterline, precisely at the ship's midsection near the galley and chief petty officer's mess. The impact of the fiberglass hull against the reinforced steel of the destroyer was followed instantly by the detonation of 500 pounds of high explosive material. A massive wall of orange flame and oily black smoke erupted from the side of the vessel, rising over 100 feet into the stagnant air of the Aden harbor. The shockwave of the first explosion rippled through the 8,500-ton ship, lifting the deck several inches and shattering light fixtures and computer monitors across all 5 decks of the superstructure. Before the echoes of the first blast could dissipate, the second boat made contact 40 feet aft of the initial breach. This second detonation targeted the auxiliary engine room, where the secondary generators were providing power for the ship's internal systems while moored. The pressure wave from the second blast was even more focused, driving shards of the boat's fiberglass hull and metal engine components through the outer skin of the destroyer like shrapnel. The sound was a deafening, metallic roar that drowned out the screams of the crew and the frantic ringing of the general quarters alarms. The third boat completed the triple strike 3 seconds later, impacting the forward engineering space. The combined force of the 3 explosions created a jagged, blackened hole in the port side that measured approximately 40 feet across and stretched from the main deck, down below the waterline. The sea, usually calm in the inner harbor, began to pour into the wounded ship with a terrifying, rushing sound that could be heard over the rising chaos. The air inside the ship was immediately filled with the acrid, choking smell of burnt plastic, vaporized fuel, and the metallic tang of shredded armor. Inside the galley, where dozens of sailors had been eating lunch, the world was turned upside down. The deck plates buckled and tore open, throwing men and women against the overhead bulkheads with enough force to cause immediate and severe trauma. The lights flickered and then died, plunging the smoke-filled compartments into a disorienting darkness, illuminated only by the flickering red glow of emergency lanterns, and the fires starting in the ruptured fuel lines. The crew, though stunned by the sheer violence of the triple impact, began to move, with the ingrained discipline of their training, reaching for emergency breathing devices and feeling their way through the thickening haze. On the bridge, the commanding officer fought to maintain his footing as the ship groaned under the weight of the incoming water. The digital displays for the ship's list indicator began to climb steadily. 3 degrees, then 5, then 8 degrees to port. The USS Cole was no longer a proud symbol of American naval power. It was a wounded animal, listing heavily as thousands of tons of seawater flooded into the engineering and berthing spaces. The executive officer reported that the forward engine room was already waist-deep in water, and that the primary fire main had been severed by the second explosion. The heat near the blast site was intense, reaching temperatures of over 1,000 degrees as the remains of the fast boats and the ship's own fuel supplies burned. The external skin of the destroyer began to glow a dull, angry red around the time edges of the breach. In the water surrounding the ship, debris from the attack pieces of fiberglass, shredded life jackets, and unidentifiable fragments floated in, a growing slick of black oil. The silence that had preceded the attack was replaced by the cacophony of damage control teams shouting orders, the hiss of escaping steam, and the relentless thud of the ship's hull settling deeper into the silt of the harbor floor. Casualties were immediate and heavy. Initial reports coming into the battle dressing stations indicated that at least 17 sailors had been killed instantly in the initial blasts, with over 30 others suffering from blast-related injuries, severe burns, and smoke inhalation. The medical teams, led by the ship's doctor and stunning, independent duty corpsmen, began triaging the wounded on the mess decks, working by the light of flashlights as the ship continued to tilt. The list had now reached 12 degrees, and the sounds of unsecured equipment sliding across the decks added to the sense of impending disaster. Despite the devastation, the United States Navy's damage control organization began to take hold. Teams in heavy blue firefighting suits emerged from the smoke, dragging hoses and portable pumps toward the flooding compartments. They were fighting two wars at once, one against the fires threatening to reach the ammunition magazines, and another against the relentless sea that sought to pull the destroyer under. The survival of the USS Cole now rested entirely on the shoulders of the young sailors who, only minutes before, had been looking forward to a routine afternoon in port. 12:20 in the afternoon. The main deck of the destroyer DDG-67 USS Cole. The fight to save the ship shifted from the surface of the harbor to the dark, flooded guts of the engineering spaces. The list had stabilized at 15 degrees to port, a precarious angle that made every movement across the oil-slicked decks a struggle against gravity. In the damage control central station, the damage control assistant monitored the rising water levels in the forward and aft engine rooms, realizing that the ship was currently taking on water at a rate of 3,000 gallons per minute. The air inside the ship was a thick, suffocating soup of humidity, atomized fuel, and the smell of ozone from shorted electrical panels. At 12:25, the first damage control teams reached the boundary bulkheads of the primary breach. Clad in heavy firefighting ensembles and carrying emergency escape breathing devices, the sailors found themselves waist-deep in a mixture of seawater and marine diesel fuel. The water was dark and opaque, hiding jagged shards of the hull that had been peeled inward like a tin can. Using hydraulic spreaders and heavy wooden shoring beams, the teams began the desperate work of reinforcing the weakened bulkheads. Every time a heavy swell from a passing harbor craft hit the ship, the damaged steel groaned and shrieked, a sound that vibrated through the bones of every sailor in the compartment. The logistics of the repair effort were a testament to the systematic training of the United States Navy. Despite the loss of primary electrical power, the crew deployed Pone 100 portable pumps, dragging the 100-pound gasoline-powered units up narrow ladders and through smoke-filled passageways. The roar of the pump engines added to the cacophony, their exhaust hoses snaking out of portholes to vent the deadly carbon monoxide. At 12:40, the first signs of progress appeared as the pumps began to match the rate of the incoming tide, holding the water level steady in the auxiliary machinery room. The environmental conditions inside the lower decks were nightmarish. The heat from the fires on the port side had turned the surrounding compartments into ovens, with temperatures hovering near 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors worked in 20-minute shifts, their coveralls soaked with sweat and oil, before being rotated out to the weather decks for air. The smell of the harbor, a mix of salt, sewage, and industrial waste, was now part of the ship's internal atmosphere, drawn in through the 40-foot hole in the hull. By 12:50 in the afternoon, the bucket brigade had formed. Over 200 sailors stood in a line that stretched from the flooded galley up 3 flights of stairs to the starboard rail. They passed heavy plastic buckets filled with oily water and debris, a primitive but effective supplement to the mechanical pumps. There was no talking, only the rhythmic sound of heavy breathing and the slosh of water. This was the professional reality of a U.S. Navy crew in extremis. When the high-tech systems failed, the survival of the vessel depended on the physical endurance and discipline of the individual sailor. In the engineering office, the chief engineer and his technicians worked by flashlight to map out the ship's electrical grid. They needed to isolate the damaged sections to prevent a catastrophic fire while restoring power to the remaining sensors and weapon systems. One by one, they flipped the heavy manual breakers, bypasses being run with thick orange emergency cables known as jumper leads. At exactly 1 in the afternoon, the ship's internal communication system, the 1MC, crackled back to life. The voice of the commanding officer echoed through the ship, calm and steady, informing the crew that while the damage was severe, the USS Cole was staying afloat. However, the threat was not over. As the crew worked to stabilize the ship, lookouts on the bridge reported several unidentified small craft hovering at the edge of the exclusion zone, approximately 2,000 yards away. The possibility of a second wave of attackers hung over the crew like a shadow. Every sailor not involved in damage control or medical aid was ordered to man the remaining topside weapons. The M2 HB 50 caliber machine guns were reloaded, and the crews tracked the distant contacts with grim intensity. The deck of the destroyer remained tilted, a constant reminder of the thousands of tons of water still pressing against the internal walls. Every weld, every rivet, and every shoring beam was being tested by the immense pressure of the sea. Below decks, the sailors continued to hammer wooden plugs into small leaks and wrap ruptured pipes with emergency water-activated repair patches. They were no longer just sailors. They were the only thing standing between the USS Cole and the bottom of the Port of Aden. The fight to stay afloat had become a war of inches, measured by the steady rhythm of the pumps and the unwavering resolve of the crew. 1:15 in the afternoon. The inner harbor of Aden, Yemen. The 5 unidentified craft, which had been loitering near the commercial shipping lanes for the last 30 minutes, suddenly accelerated in a staggered line abreast formation. The commanding officer on the bridge of the USS Cole did not hesitate this time. The rules of engagement had been clarified by the blood already spilled on the mess decks, and the red line for any unauthorized vessel was now set at 1,000 yards. The air smelled of ozone, burnt gunpowder, and the heavy salt spray kicked up by the incoming boats as the destroyer's remaining defensive systems came alive. The port side Mark 38 25mm chain gun, situated on the upper superstructure, slewed toward the lead contact with a motorized whine. The gunner, a second-class gunner's mate, adjusted his thermal sights against the shimmering heat haze rising from the water at coordinates 12 degrees north, 44 degrees east. At 1,500 yards, the order was broadcast over the ship's internal circuits. Engagement authorized. Destroy all hostile surface contacts. The M2 HB 50 caliber machine guns on the starboard and port rails opened fire first, sending bright red tracers skipping across the surface of the green water. The sound of the machine guns was a steady, rhythmic thudding that shook the listing deck, a physical vibration that the crew felt in their teeth. The lead boat, a blue-hulled craft carrying 4 armed men and several large drums of fuel, ignored the warning bursts and continued to close the distance at 45 knots. The 25mm chain gun fired its first 3-round burst. The high-explosive incendiary rounds struck the water 50 yards short, creating 3 distinct white plumes. The gunner made a micro-adjustment to the joystick. The second burst found the target. The shells punched through the fiberglass bow and detonated inside the cockpit, instantly shredding the hull and the men inside. The boat vanished in a spray of white foam and blue fragments, its engines still screaming as it sank beneath the surface of the harbor. The remaining 4 boats began to zigzag, attempting to complicate the targeting solutions of the American gunners. On the bridge, the tactical action officer directed the fire of the 3 remaining operational 50 caliber mounts with surgical precision. The discipline of the United States Navy crew remained unbroken, even as the ship continued to groan from the flooding below. One boat attempted to bank hard toward the stern, seeking a blind spot in the destroyer's defensive arc near the helicopter flight deck. The aft 50 caliber gunner tracked the movement, leading the target by 2 boat lengths, and squeezed the long-arm trigger. A stream of half-inch diameter projectiles tore into the outboard engines, causing the stern of the boat to erupt in a fireball of gasoline and magnesium. The craft spun wildly, caught in its own wake, before flipping over and coming to a dead stop. Seeing 2 of their number destroyed in less than 3 minutes, the remaining 3 craft turned back toward the safety of the commercial piers, fleeing the lethal range of the destroyer's guns. The harbor fell into a tense, expectant silence, broken only by the hum of the portable pumps and the distant sirens of Yemeni emergency vehicles on the shore. The gunners remained at their stations, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of a third wave. Their faces were smeared with carbon and sweat, their hands steady on the spade grips of their weapons. The perimeter was secure, but every sailor on the weather deck knew that the battle for the USS Cole was transitioning into its most dangerous phase. 1:45 in the afternoon. The inner harbor of Aden, Yemen. The USS Cole sat low in the water, its port side gaping open like a jagged wound, when a large wooden DOO began to drift toward the exclusion zone. Inside the bridge, the commanding officer watched the thermal feed from the AN/SPY-1 radar system, which was now operating on emergency battery power and limited sensor range. A small, fast-moving contact suddenly detached from the shadow of the larger DOO, accelerating toward the destroyer's vulnerable stern at 45 knots. The air was thick with the scent of burning rubber and the heavy, humid heat of the Arabian Peninsula, making every breath a chore for the exhausted crew. The tactical action officer identified the threat as another fiberglass-hulled attack craft, but this one was equipped with more than just explosives. A man in the bow of the approaching craft stood up and leveled a shoulder-fired rocket-propelled grenade launcher at the ship's superstructure. The trigger was squeezed, and the rocket shrieked off the launcher, a white column of fire punching backward through the humid air and leaving a lingering trail of chemical smoke. The heat from the propellant washed over the surface of the water, momentarily bleaching the thermal optics of the ship's defensive cameras. The warhead drove straight into the armored glass of the bridge wing, detonating instantly and sending a spray of razor-sharp fragments across the deck. The explosion blew apart the communication antennas and severed the hydraulic lines for the forward searchlights, filling the air with the sharp smell of burning electronics and hydraulic fluid. The shockwave threw the bridge team against the starboard bulkheads, the sound of the blast cracking eardrums and shattering the remaining glass in the navigation consoles. Metal fragments hissed as they bit into the gray paint of the superstructure, leaving glowing pockmarks in the steel. The sailors at the starboard MH-60 Sierra Helicopter Detachment, currently serving as deck security, reacted with the cold precision of their training. They wrenched their M2 HB-50 caliber machine guns toward the threat and depressed the spade grip triggers in long, controlled bursts. A stream of heavy half-inch projectiles tore through the fiberglass hull of the suicide boat, punching clean through the engine block and detonating the internal fuel tanks. The craft erupted into a white-hot fireball that rose 50 feet into the air, its momentum carrying the burning wreckage into the side of a nearby concrete pier where it disintegrated into thousands of charred fragments. The sound of metal tearing and the roar of the explosion faded into a dead silence, leaving only the crackling of flames and the distant sound of the ship's internal alarms. Black smoke rose from the remains of the attacker, drifting over the harbor as the gun crews on the USS Cole reloaded their weapons in grim anticipation of a third strike. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of floating debris and the orange glow of burning fuel slicks on the water's surface. On the bridge, the commanding officer wiped blood from his forehead and picked up the sound-powered telephone to check the status of his gunners. The defense of the ship had been successful, but the cost was rising as the secondary systems began to fail from the stress of the blasts. The gunners' mates reported that they had expended 400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 24 rounds of 25mm high-explosive shells in the last 10 minutes. They were now operating on their final reserves of ready-use ammunition, with the magazines still flooded and inaccessible to the handling teams. Every sailor topside remained in a crouched position, eyes scanning the horizon at coordinates 12 degrees 48 minutes north, 44 degrees 58 minutes east. Tactically, the USS Cole was now a fortress under siege, its ability to move completely neutralized by the thousands of tons of seawater in its hold. The engineering teams reported that the list had increased to 17 degrees, a critical threshold that threatened the stability of the ship if any more weight was added. To the port side, the chief engineer requested permission to counterflood the starboard tanks, a risky maneuver that would bring the ship deeper into the water, but would correct the dangerous tilt. The commanding officer authorized the move, knowing that every gallon of water added was a gamble against the harbor floor. The crew worked in a state of hypervigilance, their senses heightened by the adrenaline of the recent engagement and the constant threat of another strike. The smell of the sea was now entirely masked by the sense of combat, burnt powder, melting insulation, and the metallic tang of blood from the bridge casualties. Despite the carnage, the chain of command remained intact, with orders being passed through hand signals and messengers as the primary radio nets remained offline. The United States Navy's presence in Aden had been challenged with extreme violence, but the flag still flies over the scarred superstructure of the destroyer. 2:15 in the afternoon. The engineering spaces of the destroyer DDG-67, USS Cole. The fight to save the ship from structural failure moved into its most critical phase as the list reached 17 degrees to port. In the Damage Control Central Station, the chief engineer and the damage control assistant analyzed the ship's stability curves on paper charts as the primary computer systems remained dark. The 40-foot hole in the hull was allowing the sea to exert hundreds of tons of pressure against the internal transverse bulkheads, which were never designed to hold the weight of the ocean. The air in the lower decks was a stagnant, oily mist that coated the lungs of the damage control teams, who were now working their fourth consecutive hour without rest. The order was given to begin emergency counterflooding of the starboard fuel and ballast tanks to pull the ship back toward an even keel. This was a high-stakes calculation. Adding more weight to a ship already low in the water increased the risk of the vessel sinking straight down into the harbor silt. At exactly 2:25, the valves were manually cranked open in the starboard pump room. The sound of water rushing into the empty tanks was a hollow, echoing roar that competed with the screech of the distorted metal frames. The deck beneath the sailors' feet began to vibrate with the sheer mass of the shifting fluids. On the port side, near the center of the blast, the shoring teams faced a different kind of terror. The main transverse bulkhead, which separated the flooded engine room from the aft berthing spaces, was beginning to oil can or bow inward under the weight of the water. The sound of the steel flexing was like a series of gunshots echoing through the narrow passageways. Using 6x6-inch Douglas fir timbers, the sailors constructed K-type shoring, wedging the massive beams against the overhead and the deck to transfer the load. The heat in the compartment was 115 degrees, and the smell of the wood charring against the hot metal added a new layer. Against the hot metal added a new layer to the thick atmosphere. The structural integrity of the USS Cole was being held together by the brute force of these wooden beams and the physical strength of the young men and women holding them in place. Every time the ship shifted, even by half a degree, the pressure on the shores increased, causing the wood to groan and the sand-filled grip pads to hiss. At coordinates 12 degrees 48 minutes north, 44 degrees 58 minutes east, the destroyer was a laboratory of applied physics and raw human willpower. The damage control assistant reported that the list had been reduced to 12 degrees, a significant improvement that allowed the portable pumps to operate more efficiently. Logistically, the supply of shoring material was running dangerously low. The ship's carpenter and the hull technicians began dismantling non-essential wooden furniture and bunks to create more support structures. Every piece of lumber was measured, cut, and hammered into place with the rhythmic precision of an assembly line. The professionalism of the crew was evident in the silence of their work. There was no panic, only the steady thud of sledgehammers and the quiet reporting of water levels over the sound-powered telephones. The light from their battle lanterns reflected off the oily surface of the water, casting long, dancing shadows against the blackened bulkheads. By 3 in the afternoon, the structural breathing of the ship had slowed. The counterflooding had successfully brought the list down to 9 degrees, and the shoring was holding firm against the pressure of the sea. The immediate threat of the ship capsizing had been neutralized, but the 40-foot breach remained a catastrophic open wound. The engineering team now turned their attention to the soft patches using heavy rubber sheets and steel plating to slow the secondary leaks in the fuel lines and fire mains. Each small victory was marked by a reduction in the roar of the incoming water, replaced by the steady, mechanical hum of the Pone 100 pumps. The exterior of the ship remained a scene of devastation, but the internal city of the destroyer was fighting back. The crew had established a systematic rotation, ensuring that the sailors in the hottest and most dangerous compartments were replaced every 30 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. Gallon after gallon of lukewarm water was passed down the lines to the engineering spaces, a vital logistics chain that kept the human machinery of the damage control effort running. The USS Cole was battered, listing, and scarred, but its heart was still beating thanks to a professional response that had turned a potential sinking into a stable, if desperate, defense. 3:15 in the afternoon, the sky above the Port of Aden and the wounded destroyer. The first sign of reinforcements was not a ship on the horizon, but a low, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the humid coastal air and deep into the marrow of the exhausted crew. Two MH-60 Sierra helicopters, detached from a nearby amphibious-ready group, crested the rocky volcanic hills surrounding the harbor at an altitude of 500 feet. The lead aircraft, call sign Knight Rider 1, banked hard to port, its door-mounted GAU-2150 caliber machine gun scanning the cluttered harbor for any remaining surface threats. The second helicopter hovered 300 feet above the water, its winch operator preparing the rescue hoist for the first wave of critically wounded sailors. On the deck of the USS Cole, the flight deck crew worked with feverish intensity to clear the aft landing zone of twisted metal, discarded life jackets, and heavy damage control gear. The 9-degree list of the ship made the flight deck a treacherous, slanted platform, slick with sea spray and the oily residue of the morning's explosions. The air boss, perched in the control tower with a handheld radio, monitored the wind speed and the ship's erratic movement as it strained against its mooring lines. At coordinates 12 degrees, 48 minutes north, 44 degrees, 58 minutes east, the destroyer was now the center of a high-stakes aerial ballet. Despite the tilt, the air boss signaled the first helicopter to begin its approach, his orange wands cutting through the thick black smoke still drifting from the hull. The smell of burnt jet fuel, known as JP5, began to compete with the acrid stink of the smoldering engineering spaces as the aircraft descended toward the fantail. The downdraft from the four-bladed rotor system lashed the water around the stern, creating a localized storm of salt spray that coated the faces of the litter bearers. Inside the helicopter, two Navy search and rescue corpsmen sat on the edge of the cabin, their medical kits organized for the immediate treatment of severe blast trauma. At exactly 3:25, the first litter was hoisted into the cabin of the hovering Sierra, carrying a sailor with third-degree burns and internal injuries. The process was a masterpiece of professional coordination, with the pilots maintaining a stable hover despite the unpredictable thermal currents rising from the burning ship. The winch cable hummed with tension as it pulled the wounded upward, the sailor's form disappearing into the belly of the aircraft. One by one, the most critical casualties were lifted from the deck, their status monitored by the ship's independent duty corpsmen who had worked without rest. The Overwatch helicopter continued its orbit, its crew watching the small boats in the harbor with the focus of a predator, ready to engage at the first sign of hostility. The door gunner kept his hand on the spade grips of the GAU-21, the long belt of 50 caliber ammunition gleaming in the harsh afternoon sun. The arrival of the air element provided a massive boost to the morale of the crew below. It was a visible and audible sign that the full resources of the United States Navy were now engaged in their survival. The sound of the rotors provided a protective canopy over the scarred gray hull that refused to sink. The coordination between the ship and the aircraft was handled through a series of tactical data links and voice circuits that had been restored by the electronics technicians. Coordinates for the medical evacuation destination were transmitted to a nearby landing platform dock, which was standing by 20 miles offshore with a full surgical team. By 4 in the afternoon, 12 of the most critically injured sailors had been successfully evacuated, leaving the ship's remaining medical team to focus on the 32 personnel with less life-threatening wounds. The transition was seamless, a result of the standardized training that allowed air crews and shipboard personnel to function as a single unit. As the second helicopter completed its final pickup, it transitioned to an external cargo role. Using a heavy-duty nylon sling, the aircrew prepared to deliver 3 additional Pone 100 portable pumps and 500 feet of reinforced discharge hose from a nearby supply ship. The extra pumping capacity was vital, as the primary drainage systems in the aft engine room were beginning to fail under the constant strain of the salt water. the pumps were lowered directly onto the slanted deck, where they were immediately seized by the damage control teams and dragged toward the smoke-filled hatches of the lower decks. The sky shield remained in place as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The two MH-60 Sierra helicopters were joined by a third aircraft, a maritime strike version equipped with advanced radar, which began a wider sweep of the Yemeni coastline to identify any potential staging areas for further attacks. The air above the USS Cole was now a controlled environment, a bubble of American air power that allowed the crew to focus entirely on the structural war occurring below the waterline. The Sky Shield had not only saved lives through rapid evacuation, but had provided the logistical lifeline necessary to keep the ship's heart beating. The logistics of the air operation were managed with the same systematic precision as the defense of the ship. Each helicopter sortie was logged, every gallon of JP-5 fuel accounted for, and every casualty tracked by name and serial number. This was the professional reality of a U.S. Navy campaign report. The heroism of the individual was supported by a massive, disciplined machine of global reach. As the helicopters banked away to refuel and return, the crew on the deck of the Cole watched them go, knowing that while they were still in a fight for their lives, they were no longer fighting it alone. 4:30 in the afternoon. The concrete piers of the Port of Aden, Yemen. The lead heavy-lift helicopter, an MH-53 Echo Sea Dragon, crested the harbor breakwater and flared its massive rotors over the primary refueling pier. It was carrying the first platoon of the United States Marine Corps Fleet Anti-Terrorism Security Teams, known as FAST Teams, which had been diverted from a regional staging base in Bahrain. The air over the pier was a swirling vortex of grit, the smell of burnt rubber, and the heavy, stagnant heat of the Yemeni coast, all churned into a frenzy by the downdraft of the aircraft. Within seconds of the wheels touching the sun-baked concrete, the rear ramp dropped, and 24 Marines in full combat gear surged outward to claim the ground. The insertion was a masterpiece of professional military precision, designed to transition the Port of Aden from a civilian harbor into a high-security military exclusion zone. The Marines moved in two-man teams, their M4 carbines held at the ready as they established a 360-degree defensive perimeter around the landward side of the wounded USS Cole. Their boots made a rhythmic, heavy thud against the scorched asphalt, a sound that signaled a decisive shift in the tactical landscape. At coordinates 12 degrees 48 minutes north, 44 degrees 58 minutes east, the pier was no longer under the uncertain jurisdiction of local harbor police. It was now a United States sovereign defensive line. By 4:45 in the afternoon, the Marines had established 12 hardened machine gun nests using sandbags and temporary concrete barriers found on the pier. Two M240 Bravo machine guns were positioned to cover the long, narrow neck of the pier, while 6 designated marksmen climbed the heights of the nearby fuel silos to provide long-range overwatch. The heat on the pier was a blistering 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the glare from the white concrete was blinding. But the Marines remained motionless behind their optics, scanning the labyrinth of shipping containers and warehouses for any sign of land-based threats. The logistical handover between the United States Navy and the Marine Corps was executed with the quiet efficiency of a shared training doctrine. The platoon commander of the FAST team met with the destroyer's executive officer at the edge of the brow, the gangplank that was currently the only physical link between the ship and the shore. They spoke in low, urgent tones, clarifying the new rules of engagement. Any unauthorized vehicle or person crossing the 500-meter marker on the pier would be engaged with non-lethal warnings, followed immediately by decisive fire. The exhausted sailors who had been manning the topside 50 caliber mounts were finally relieved, allowing them to descend back into the smoke-filled hull. To join the damage control effort, the presence of the Marines provided a physical and psychological barrier that allowed the crew of the USS Cole to focus entirely on their internal war against the sea. On the pier, the FAST teams deployed thermal imaging systems and ground surveillance radar to monitor the harbor's edge, creating a digital tripwire that would alert them to any swimmers or small craft attempting a stealthy approach under the cover of the industrial docks. The smell of the harbor, a mix of salt, sewage, and the iron scent of the wounded ship, clung to their uniforms as the desert wind picked up, carrying the fine white dust of the Aden interior. At 5 in the evening, a second wave of reinforcements arrived via a high-speed catamaran transport. This group brought with them specialized equipment, including portable lighting towers, satellite communication arrays, and 2 tons of additional fresh water and medical supplies. The pier was rapidly transformed into a forward operating base, complete with a tactical operations center housed in a series of reinforced tents. The Marines established a systematic checkpoint system at the pier's entrance, utilizing armored vehicles to block the main access road and ensuring that every person entering the zone was biometrically verified against a pre-approved list. The interaction with the local Yemeni authorities was handled by a dedicated civil affairs team that arrived with the second wave. They were professional but firm, making it clear that the security of the United States Navy vessel was the absolute priority of the United States government. The local port officials were moved to a separate facility 2 miles away, leaving the immediate vicinity of the Cole under the total control of the Marine Corps. This logistical isolation was essential to prevent a follow-on attack during the critical hours when the ship was most vulnerable. As the shadows lengthened across the harbor, the pier took on the appearance of a fortress. The constant hum of the Marines' portable generators joined the rhythmic thud of the ship's pumps, creating a mechanical symphony of survival. The fast team members, their faces smeared with camouflaged grease paint to combat the glare, rotated through their watches with the disciplined silence that defined their unit. They were the outer shell of the defense, a professional guard force that ensured the sailors inside the Cole could hammer their shoring and pump their bilges without having to look over their shoulders. The United States had secured the ground, and the line in the sand had been drawn with the weight of an entire Marine expeditionary force. 6 in the evening. The Port of Aden, Yemen. The DDG-67 USS Cole was finally stable, its list held at a constant 9 degrees by the tireless efforts of the engineering department and the massive influx of external pumping capacity. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long, crimson shadows across the scarred hull, the mission transitioned from a desperate fight for survival to a systematic salvage and recovery operation. The air in the harbor had cooled slightly, but it remained thick with the smell of salt spray, diesel fuel, and the lingering, metallic scent of the morning's violence. At coordinates 12 degrees 48 minutes north, 44 degrees 58 minutes east, the United States Navy had held its ground. The final casualty report was a somber testament to the professionalism and sacrifice of the crew. 17 sailors had been killed in action, most of them lost in the initial 3-boat strike on the galley and engineering spaces. 39 others were listed as injured, ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to severe blast trauma, with all critical cases already evacuated to advanced medical facilities by the MH-60 Sierra helicopters. Each name was recorded with the precision of a formal military report, a list of heroes who had stood their watch until the very end. The ship's flag, tattered by the heat and the shock waves of the explosions, was replaced by a fresh ensign that snapped defiantly in the evening breeze. The physical damage to the destroyer was catastrophic, but not terminal. The 40-foot by 40-foot hole in the port side exposed the blackened ribs of the ship's internal structure, a jagged cavern that had swallowed thousands of tons of seawater. However, the shoring teams had successfully reinforced over 200 feet of transverse bulkheads, and the counterflooding of the starboard tanks had ensured that the center of gravity remained within safe limits. The professional assessment by the arriving salvage master was clear. The USS Cole would not sink in the Port of Aden. The vessel would eventually be towed to deeper water and loaded onto a heavy-lift ship for the long journey back to the United States for full reconstruction. The Iranian-backed attack had failed in its strategic objective to sink a billion-dollar American warship and close the Suez transit lanes. Instead, the engagement resulted in the total destruction of 7 enemy fast attack craft and the deaths of at least 14 attackers. The professional response of the United States Navy and the Marine Corps fast teams had turned a tactical ambush into a demonstration of American resilience and logistical depth. On the pier, the Marines maintained their silent vigil, their thermal optics sweeping the darkened harbor for any sign of movement, while the sailors on the deck of the Cole continued their watches with the grim discipline of a crew that had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. At 8 in the evening, the heavy lift vessel arrived at the mouth of the harbor, its lights a constellation of hope on the black water. The recovery of the USS Cole would take weeks of meticulous engineering work, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The destroyer had served 3 direct hits and 2 follow-on attacks, a feat of structural engineering and human willpower that would be studied at the United States Naval Academy for generations. The Aden ambush was over, and the professional standard of the United States Navy remained the benchmark for maritime combat operations. The final report concluded that, while the cost had been severe, the objective had been achieved. The ship remained afloat, the perimeter was secure, and the attackers had been obliterated. As the moon rose over the Gulf of Aden, the silence of the harbor was no longer the silence of fear, but the quiet, heavy stillness of a battlefield where the victors were busy preparing for the next watch. The USS Cole would sail again, a living symbol of a crew that would not be broken, and a nation that would not be intimidated in the pursuit of its global mission.